Well, hello. In this video, we are going to speak about the different parts of the central nervous system. This is a continuation of a previous segment that is titled Overview of the Central Nervous System. So in here, we are going to speak about the diencephalon and then the cerebrum. The diencephalon consists of two structures. Again, di means two, and encephalon means brain. It is almost like they looked at the thalamus and the hypothalamus as if they were a brain on their own. So these two structures together, they make what is known as the diencephalon, and they, as you could see, they are deep in the brain, in the core of the brain. And they sit on top of the midbrain. The thalamus is a hub for connections, and the thalamus is connected to most of the cerebral cortex and connects with lower structures as well, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, front, back, and then vertical connections. So it's extensively connected. And generally, this is just a quick overview, a very shallow overview. The thalamus enables us to perform sensory gating. In other words, it gets all kinds of sensory information flowing through, coming from below or from the rest of the body, and it attenuates or decreases the effect of very kind of noxious or loud or strong sensory stimuli coming in. So it kind of tones them down. Or it could also, if there are some signals that are not coming in optimally, like for example you are in a noisy situation and you can't hear well in the presence of noise, the thalamus can amplify auditory signals significantly in order to make you able to enhance the signals. So the thalamus processes information as it comes from below, going to the cerebral cortex, and also from the rest of the nervous system going to the cerebral cortex. And in many cases also it processes information coming from the cerebral cortex and going down. We speak about motor because that is the information that is usually travels along descending pathways. The hypothalamus, that little area, if you can imagine the optic tract to be just taken away, that little area behind it, that is a continuation of the thalamus, that is the hypothalamus. And it contributes largely to the autonomic nervous system. So the functions of the hypothalamus are primarily autonomic nervous system functions, including the control of glands, endocrine glands in the body. For example, the pituitary gland, hormones, how they are released, and the different kind of systems that enable us, for example, to feel thirst, to feel we are hungry, we are for example, thirst or hunger or even sexual drive. So it enables us also to regulate visceral functions. Of course, it works with other areas in the brain and to regulate visceral functions inside of the trunk. These include digestion, for example. They include blood regulation of the fluid, the amount of water inside of the bloodstream, to control alkalinity and acidity of the blood, to maintain it at a certain level. And it controls the kidney function to control again the amount of urine that exits the body and the amount of urine that is released. So it primarily is a system that works as part of the autonomic nervous system. It is also active in the fear response, in the fight and flight response, when the person senses danger, and then you want to deploy your body mechanisms to fight and defend yourself. The hypothalamus plays a great part in that, as it works with the amygdala and other parts to deploy the energy in your body to increase consumption of energy to have you gain strength to fight the perceived threat. Now we look at the cerebrum. Go back here. Everything, just put in here, if you put the cerebellum, put it back here, connected with the pons in the back here, that means everything that's above, all parts of the brain that are added, that wrap around these areas, these make up the cerebrum. So that big part, that is the cerebrum. So what we see outside the cover of the brain, all of this, convolutions, and we call the cover, we call it the cortex of the cerebrum, or in other words, the cerebral cortex. And when you open it up, and you see here, now here is the brain stem, and the thalamus. The hypothalamus would show a little bit here, and all of this, and then take this cerebellum, and all of this here is the cerebrum. So the cerebrum primarily is made up of gray matter, the cortex, and white matter, and some elements, some clusters of neurons, neuron bodies called nuclei, buried inside in there to do various functions. So that's what the cerebrum is. Again, it's the biggest part of the brain, and everything else here, you have the brain stem, and you have the thalamus, two thalami, or pieces of the thalamus left and right. We call them the thalamic nuclei. Okay. So now, as we go to the cerebrum is the biggest part of the brain. It makes up 77% of the total brain weight because it's big. By itself, it has about 13 billion neurons, and it has 60 trillion synaptic connections. Because the cerebral cortex, the cover of the cerebrum, is the most extensively connected part. It has most of the cell bodies of the neurons. And it has the gray matter of the cerebrum, that little tiny layer that covers the cerebrum, all of the surface. It consumes about 94% of the oxygen supply, just because the bodies of neurons reside in the cerebral cortex. First, the cerebrum is divided into, or it consists of two hemispheres, right hemisphere, left hemisphere. And as you could see in the middle, there is a big fissure in between that is called the longitudinal fissure. Goes from front to back, all the way to back. So that's the longitudinal fissure that separates the left hemisphere, right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. Now, when you look at one hemisphere, what does it have? What does it look like anatomically? You need to know the parts. So, the cerebrum consists of the following pieces. Number one, the cortex of the cerebrum, or the cerebral cortex. That layer that's on top of the cortex, that is 4 millimeters thick. Very, very small, yet it has 6 layers, and it is very, very, it has basically most of the cell bodies. So the cerebral cortex, and then it has the basal ganglia. The basal ganglia are little clusters of cell body. They do not show in this model, unfortunately. They are buried deep in the core of the brain, around the thalamus, in the core of the brain. I'll show you images. So you have the cerebral cortex, number 1, and the basal ganglia, number 2, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, or the amygdaloid nucleus, sometimes called the amygdaloid body. All of these are names for the same thing. So how many parts again does the cerebrum consist of? 4. Let's take them one by one and see how many parts does the cerebral cortex include. So first, here is the brain, right hemisphere, left hemisphere, and the corpus callosum connects both right and left. It basically connects the white matter, from the right hemisphere with the left hemisphere, and it's the biggest brain commissure. Before I get into the details about the different parts, the general functions of the cerebrum include basically storage of information. Information storage mostly happens on the cerebral cortex itself. The cerebrum is what enables us to have higher level functions, cognitive functions, language, behavioral control, emotional regulation, you name it. All of these are made possible because of the cerebrum. So it enables us to integrate motor and sensory, functions. For example, you are playing, let's say you play karate. As you play, say there's a group activity where you perform with other people. And as you perform, you are constantly watching, getting feedback through your visual modality, watching what is going on, where the other people are, what they are doing, or if you are playing with another person, and you are performing your own movement, regulating your motor behavior in relationship to the person who is playing, against you or with you. And in some cases, let's say maybe you have music or something, so you can integrate auditory, visual, motor all together. And that is what, the cerebrum enables you to perform these functions. Also, refinement of sensory input as it comes in, either increasing it or decreasing it to enhance the processing of sensory stimuli, and also emotions. I'm going to mention something briefly about language lateralization, but you need to understand that is only explained because for simplicity's sake. We understand that certain parts of the brain are dominant for certain functions. However, these brain parts cannot work on their own to perform these functions. So when we say the left hemisphere has language, yes, it has lexicon, which is the mental dictionary. It has sentence rules in Broca's area, and it enables you to comprehend the Wernicke's area, and so on. So the left hemisphere is dominant for certain functions, but it really can't work without the right hemisphere. Each one is going to contribute in its own way, and the best performance is going to require integration of functions across the hemispheres. So the left hemisphere is known to be dominant for syntax, for word semantics, like vocabulary, for processing of speech acts that show a conflict between speaker's intentions and the speaker's utterances. In other words, when someone is trying to manipulate someone else and tell them lies or manipulate them, with words, that the left hemisphere is where you process the information to understand deception and to understand that someone is not telling you what he or she really intends. So there's more analysis on the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere, it tends to deal with the holistic aspect of vision, the holistic aspect of language. For example, when you read a paragraph, you read sentence by sentence, you get the meaning from the left hemisphere. However, when you look at the whole paragraph as one unit and understand the whole point of the paragraph, the right hemisphere is what gives you that information. So when you read a whole story or a whole novel and reflect back and say, what is this about? Can I summarize it in 5 sentences? That is the right hemisphere that enables you to have that holistic view of things. Also, the right hemisphere enables you to understand the speaker's intent and the context. For example, what kind of person am I dealing with? Is that person my boss? Is this person my colleague? Should I start speaking now? Is it a good time? And you look at all aspects of the context to regulate your communication with others, or when to do something, when to stop, and so on. It enables you to develop theory of mind, to have theory of mind, to be able to read someone else's mind, to have social perspective taking. Again, it is too simplistic to say just the right hemisphere does it. No, it is both, but the right hemisphere is more dominant for it. The ability to infer implied meaning from utterances that where the meaning is not very clear, or indirect or abstract. The global aspects of discourse, as I said, if you have a whole story, it gives you the holistic meaning of the story that you can summarize, you can kind of comprehend overall. It enables you, when you speak, to produce coherent and cohesive verbal outputs so that everything is sequenced, everything is organized well, and so on. But again, I cannot emphasize enough to say that both hemispheres work together in order to make, to produce an intact verbal output or intact behavior. Now let's look at the cortex, the cerebral cortex. Cortex comes from the word tree bark. I mean, it is the meaning of it is basically a Greek, Roman word meaning tree bark. So imagine that the brain has, that gray matter that wraps around the entire brain. That is that, cover. That is the cortex. Everything beneath then has, a different name. So the cortex is folded in many different ways, and it has the prominent areas that are going up. They are called gyri, like little hills or mountains. And the areas that are dipping down, they are called sulci. So a gyrus is a prominent area that is going up like a mountain, and a sulcus is the area that is like a valley between two gyri. So one gyrus and then two gyri. One sulcus, two sulci. And then fissures sometimes are called fissures also sometimes called sulcus. However, a fissure tends to be a deep, like for example the longitudinal fissure here. So the longitudinal fissure is the big groove that basically separates the right hemisphere from the left hemisphere. So the parts of the cerebral cortex include, there are 6. And unfortunately, many people who teach this, they tell you, oh, the brain has 4 lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4. No, it has more than that. I mean, the cerebral cortex. So you have the frontal cortex or the frontal lobe. And then you have the temporal lobe or cortex, and the parietal, and then you have the occipital, which is the back area, that little purple area. In order to understand this, I'm going to discuss some of the fissures. We spoke about the longitudinal fissure that splits, divides the brain to right hemisphere, left hemisphere. Longitudinal fissure lies between the two hemispheres and extends from the front way to the back. Then we have, between the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex, we have one deep fissure in the center, almost like the center of the brain. That is called the central fissure, but it has other names. So you can call it the central fissure, or the central sulcus, or the fissure of Rolando, or the Rolandic fissure. So all of these are names for the exact same thing that we are speaking about. The gyrus in front, so the central fissure separates the frontal lobe of the brain from the parietal lobe of the brain. The central fissure extends or is perpendicular to the longitudinal fissure. It lies, 90 degrees in relation to it, and it's also perpendicular to the temporal fissure. So this is the temporal cortex, and there's a fissure that separates it from the frontal cortex, and one that separates it from the parietal cortex. So you remember, I am saying lobe and I'm saying cortex. They are the same. So the central fissure separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. The gyrus in front of the central fissure, we call it the precentral gyrus. The precentral gyrus. So that is part of the frontal lobe, and it lies in front of the central fissure. And this precentral gyrus, in terms of function, physiology, we call it the primary motor cortex. It is where you have neurons here connected to the rest of your body that actually can move your body in different parts. And there's a map that we are going to speak about called the homunculus, the motor homunculus. Now the gyrus that lies behind the central fissure, that is called the postsynaptic gyrus. I'm sorry, the postcentral gyrus. I was speaking about neural transmission and stuff, so just an hour ago. So the postcentral gyrus, and that is part of the parietal cortex. The postcentral gyrus is responsible for processing sensation from the rest of your body, like your face, how you feel cold or heat or pain and so on, is represented here in the lower area of the somatosensory cortex, where each part, like your lips, have an area where it makes you feel the sensations and the activity of your lips, and your tongue and your vocal folds, and every part of your body has areas here. So that is a map of your sensory mechanisms inside of your body, and it connects with all parts of your body. So we have the longitudinal fissure, central fissure, and then the temporal fissure. Again, it separates the temporal cortex or the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and from the parietal lobe at once. That's the temporal fissure. Then we have So these are explained. I think I'm not gonna. Yeah, okay. The last one that we'll speak about is the parieto-occipital sulcus. So you can tell from the name, parieto has to do with the parietal lobe, and occipital lobe. So the line that the sulcus or fissure that separates these is called the parieto-occipital sulcus, and you could see it here, parieto-occipital sulcus. That is the one that basically, it's not showing in this model, so basically separates is the boundary between the parietal lobe and the occipital lobe. So now we look at the basal ganglia, part number 5, part number 2 actually of the cerebral cortex. Before I continue with this, I want to point out I'm going to be speaking about the landmarks in terms of the lobes, but these are 4 lobes, and there are 2 more that we will speak about in a few minutes. But now we just finished the fissures, the sulci and the fissures. So let's go to the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, and then we'll leave the cortex again. We'll come back to it later. So the basal ganglia are clusters of cell body, as you could see here, clusters of cell bodies, and that are specialized in a common function. And they are found deeper in the brain, and there are 5 pieces of them. So these are the putamen, the caudate nucleus, and the subthalamic nuclei, these green areas, subthalamic nuclei, and then substantia nigra and the globus pallidus. So they're together, collectively, these 5 nuclei, when we call again, because cell bodies mostly reside in the cerebral cortex. That makes it gray because they use a lot of dopamine, oxygen and glucose and a lot of neurotransmitters and so on. So that makes it physically gray. And cell bodies that exist in clusters beneath the cortex, somewhere deeper in the brain, we call them nuclei, or we call them bodies, or ganglia, a cluster of cell bodies together that have a similar function. So these 5 structures again include the putamen, globus pallidus, caudate nucleus, substantia nigra, and subthalamic nuclei. Collectively, what they do is they serve as relay stations for information that's coming from above and going down. It goes through them and they process it and then transmit it to the next lower areas, or bringing in information as it comes from lower areas and it goes through these basal ganglia to be processed before the information goes then to the cortex. There are 3, so these are the major functions of the basal ganglia. They have many, many functions, but these are the primary functions. Number 1, they regulate motor activity, and they regulate mood and motivation, and they regulate also attention, and they regulate social communication. So they play a very important part in these areas through pathways that they have with the frontal part of the brain, with the frontal lobe of the brain. So here's another view where you have, see, the putamen, and next to it is the globus pallidus. It is not showing, but it's right behind it. And then you have the caudate nucleus, and you go to the tail of the caudate, so it curves all the way. If you cut that, then this is what you would see. You would see pieces of them. And here's again the globus pallidus and putamen, head of the caudate nucleus, and then tail of the caudate nucleus, and then the amygdaloid nucleus, or the amygdala, or the amygdaloid body. The hippocampus is a memory processing center. The hippocampus does not store memories for good. It stores, memory stays there for just, some time, hours or so, and it gets processed and sorted out, and then it goes to the storage sites on the cerebral cortex. So the hippocampus lies behind the temporal cortex. So you have the temporal cortex or gyrus, the temporal lobe is here. Let me go back to it. So here, if you go to the middle temporal gyrus, and you go inside, deep inside of the middle temporal gyrus, you are going to find the hippocampus. It is called hippocampus. It is taken from the ancient Syrian language, or Phoenician, called Phoenician language, and for the word seahorse, because the hippocampus looks like a seahorse. So you could see it here, hippocampus, and so the idea is that the hippocampus is the site where all information that is coming in is going to go to the hippocampus. The hippocampus will store it, process the information, sort it out, even tag information based on its importance. And then it initiates storage of the information permanently in the cortex, and the sites in the cortex. And through the process of initiating storage, it is going to connect with the frontal part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex. There are pathways that where they send information back and forth, basically to determine what to store, what to discard, and what should take priority, and so on. But the information does not stay permanently in the hippocampus. In the meantime, another function of the hippocampus is when you want to recall information, you go to the hippocampus, and it enables you to access information in from your long-term memory sites. And then the amygdala. The functions of it is to mediate emotional processing. It is your primary emotional processing center. It processes fear and social, events and social stimuli. It enables you to develop the fight or flight response, and it is critical to emotional learning. It is critical to motivation. It facilitates memory and learning, especially when the information or the event you are dealing with has a high personal importance. Like personally, you feel involved in it. This is why if you activate the amygdala, then you are going to activate the hippocampus. They are right next to each other, and the amygdala in many ways regulates the functions of your memory processing center. It regulates the functions in many cases of the hippocampus. It even regulates its neuroplasticity to make it even rewire itself in different ways. That highlights the importance of emotions to learning. So now, let's look now at the cerebral cortex. The cerebral cortex is what makes us largely unique on Earth. It is what makes human beings the most sophisticated in the world. The extent of the cortex and the convolutions and the gyri and all of this, the thickness, how the gyri go up and go down, that is critical. We are the only animals that have this sophisticated surface. You know, that is a 3-pound thing, but see what it has done in the world. So let's look at that cortex, that cover of the hemispheres, and it is again 4 millimeters thick, very, very tiny, yet it is very, it consumes 94% of your oxygen supply. So it includes the cerebral cortex. Basically, you know, it includes the gray matter and includes, let's take the white matter out, includes the corpus callosum, each hemisphere has 4 visible lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital, and temporal lobe. And then there's one that is buried under the foldings, and we call it the insula because it is insulated, it's kind of buried beneath. Sometimes it's called the insular cortex. And then we have the cingulate gyrus. So how many parts does the cerebral cortex have? Here's 4 lobes, 1, 2, 3, 4, and the insula, 5, and the cingulate, 6. Please do not confuse the parts of the cerebral cortex with the parts of the cerebrum. These are 2 different questions. And if I ask you about the cerebrum, and then you say, oh, 1, 2, 3, frontal lobe, parietal, you name all of these 6, you are going to get 1 point, because these are all, they make up the cortex. And the cortex is one of 4 elements of the cerebrum. So make sure not to make this mistake. So the frontal lobe of the brain, it begins with the back, the pre-central gyrus. So we said here is the central sulcus, and then the pre-central gyrus will be so this map is not very good. So here's that brown area, the primary motor cortex, and the blue area. The line between the motor cortex and the somatosensory cortex, that is the central gyrus. So again, that brown area, it has many names. If we speak about its anatomy, we call it the pre-central gyrus. Just something on a map. If you tell me what is the function of that pre-central gyrus, we say, oh, it's motor. It is the motor cortex that has a map of the body, as you could see here. That image of that little person is called the homunculus, and it shows you, I'm going to explain it in a minute, but how the body is mapped on the cortex, and every part here controls a particular part of the body, for you to move. So the frontal lobe includes many important landmarks, and a lot of them have to do with motor and motor planning, and also with attention and memory and decision making and judgment and so on. The frontal lobes are critical. It is very hard to live without them, or if they are damaged. So we have the precentral gyrus, which is the primary motor cortex, and the premotor areas that are used for planning of motor activities before you do them. And also the prefrontal cortex, the area right behind your forehead, and you have Broca's area. But Broca's area is only found in the left hemisphere. You do not call the other area here. You only call this area in the left hemisphere Broca's area. So these are a few things about the functions, a few functions of every area here. Let me point these out first on the map. I'm gonna go back. All right. So let's go here. This is the central sulcus here. Now, from that point on, everything forward to the very end, that is the frontal lobe of the brain. So the central gyrus here is your motor cortex. The functions of it are motor. An area in front of the precentral gyrus, the area in front of it directly here, all of this area, is concerned with motor planning. And this area is called the premotor cortex. The premotor cortex goes from just about here, going down to the very end, where to the very end of the inferior frontal lobe. Premotor cortex. And then the area above that premotor cortex here, basically, just about here, and continues between the hemispheres, that is called the supplementary motor area here, on the superior, posterior segment of the frontal lobe, and between, also it continues between the two hemispheres. So that is the supplementary motor area. And then we spoke about the prefrontal cortex, that whole area behind the skull, behind the forehead, that is called the prefrontal cortex. Broca's area, if you look at these two little areas here, that is where Broca's area is. That is very, very important for language. So let's go back. The precentral gyrus, as I explained, the functions of it are motor. Sometimes we call it the motor strip, sometimes we call it the primary motor cortex or the motor cortex. You need to know where it is. You need to understand its location and exactly be prepared to pinpoint it on a map, to draw a line around it, to precisely pinpoint it on a map. So it is anterior to the central fissure, and it is the area for voluntary movement of all body parts that you can move voluntarily. And then the supplementary motor area is a planning area, motor planning area. The premotor area also, or the premotor cortex, is anterior to the primary motor cortex. and it's involved in the planning of motor activities before you perform them. So let's now look at the primary motor cortex. So here it is, that gray area here. And it continues in between the hemispheres, like this. If you imagine, say, someone sitting here and dangling his or her feet here in between the hemispheres, just like that little figure, that tells us that this area across from the toes, this area of the primary motor cortex, controls the movements of the toes. The area above controls the movement of the ankle. The area above controls the movement of the knee. And then the area on top here controls the movement of the torso. And then the shoulders and the arm and the elbow, and then the hand. The hand almost has like 1/4 or maybe a huge, the arm and the hand have about 1/3 of the cortex, the motor cortex representing it. Because the hand, you know, you do so much with your hand, it actually, your brain it has representations for both hands on right and left, and it's very significant. And every finger has its own area to activate it. And then the lower part, the inferior part of the motor cortex, is dedicated to movement of different parts of the neck, vocal folds, parts of the face, the mouth, the tongue, the lips. Everything that has to do with speech and swallowing is represented in the lower part. Interestingly, right in front of it, you have some premotor areas, but you also have Broca's area right there across. While we have this map here, so this little figure, the person is called the motor homunculus. It is basically a representation, a visual representation of the map of motor activation in the human, in the primary, in the brain. So for example, you could imagine if this area here is damaged, then the person is going to have damage. They can't move their muscles of the face or neck or shoulders and so on. No, not the shoulders. Shoulders are above, but the face and neck. Just again, because we have the map here now, let's look at the gyrus behind. That gyrus is part of the parietal cortex or the parietal lobe, and it lies posterior to the central fissure. So that is called the post-central gyrus. And the function of it, it has a sensory map of the entire body also. So you have the motor map here, next to it you have exactly the sensory map. So let's take, for example, this area here and the inferior motor cortex and the inferior somatosensory cortex. That is represented here. This area, the brown, activates the different parts of the face to move different muscles of the face and different parts of the face. Across this area brings in sensation from these parts of the face. Like you say here, you move the jaw, open your mouth, and on the other side, it gets signals about pain or about pressure or about whatever sensation that you get from your jaw goes right next door. So every segment of the primary somatosensory cortex is represented here, but this one, the blue, gives you sensations. It doesn't move things, but it gives you sensory information. So let's take the motor cortex again and just slice it. And they are going to, now we have sliced it, and you look and see how neurons in the cortex here send axons down, and these axons make a pathway like a big, say cable, and that's gonna go down way finally. It goes to the brain stem, and then it's going to activate your muscles, or for speech, your cheek muscles, your larynx, your vocal folds, your mouth, everything that you want to move on your face is going to be activated by this area here that is controlled, that controls face and different parts. You see how the lips are represented by a lot of, by a big area here, and the tongue also, and the hands. So think about it just as electric wiring, simply. And on the other side, so you could see now this arrow is going down. It means motor commands are going down. You make a decision to move, and then the order goes down. But this one, the blue one, the arrows are going up. It means you are bringing in sensation from different parts of the body to the somatosensory cortex, so that you can feel your toes moving, or if they have pain, you can feel your ankle. Do you have pain? Do you, and so on. And then the trunk, all the different parts of the body, every single part here makes you feel, makes you process the signals that come from different parts of your body, of that particular part of the body. Here's again the sensory, the motor homunculus, the area in between the hemispheres, is specialized in moving the toes and ankles and the knee, and then here the torso, and then the shoulders, and then a big area for the hand and arm, and then the face, and then the larynx and the throat, swallowing mechanisms here. So you could see the connections now, the axons coming down to form pathways. And that pathway that you have is called the pyramidal pathway. So the pyramidal pathway is the major motor pathway that connects the cerebral cortex, the motor cortex here, with the lower structures of the brain, the brain stem. And from the brain stem, you have connections with nerves that move different parts of the body. Or you can go down to the spinal cord. So that is a pathway, again, called the pyramidal tract, or the pyramidal pathway. As the pyramidal pathway travels down, it comes to an area where the medulla is. The medulla is shaped like an inverted pyramid, with the big, the base of the pyramid up, and then it is shaped like this. So that's called the medullary pyramids, what you see here, that make medullary pyramids. And at the lower segment of the medullary pyramids, towards the end of the medulla and the lower part, most of the motor fibers from the pyramidal tract cross over to control the other side of the body, the opposite side of the body, or we call it the contralateral side of the body. You need to understand that the site of that crossing, where the pyramidal tract crosses over, most of it crosses over to the opposite side, that site is called the pyramidal decussation, or the decussation of the pyramids. But more frequently, you refer to it as the pyramidal decussation. It means the crossover. The prefrontal cortex is very important for consciousness. If someone receives a hit here, they lose consciousness. If it's significant impact, they could lose consciousness. Momentarily. That is critical for attention regulation, for working memory, for emotional processing, and emotional regulation. taking charge of your emotions. If that part, the prefrontal cortex, is not connected to your, for example, amygdala and the basal ganglia, if it's not connected particularly to the amygdala, then the person will be having tantrums and just, they would have just behave on the impulse. But the prefrontal cortex makes them have more control over their emotions. They analyze, they think about what they do before they do it. That's the difference. So it is important for motor and verbal inhibition. It makes you determine, when is it appropriate to do this? I should wait. Should I do it now? And it makes you inhibit, avoid saying things, for example, that are not appropriate, or saying things at the wrong time, and so on. Or doing, also physically. People with ADHD will have difficulty with this inhibition because one part of their the problem they have is the poor functioning of the prefrontal cortex. Also, it is important for the thinking and for motivation, regulating your motivation, and also for problem solving, for making judgment about things, and for social communication, for pragmatics. The prefrontal cortex is also critical for integrating ideas and language. So it has numerous functions, and these are just a few. I would like you to know, to be able to list a number of functions of the prefrontal cortex, and all the structures that we have. I'd like you to understand their anatomy, the anatomy of every area, be able to identify the area on the map, and also be able to list a number of its functions. We are still speaking about the frontal lobe of the brain. Now we speak about Broca's area. Broca's area is the area that lies in the inferior, posterior frontal lobe, in front of the foot of the premotor cortex. So you have here, you have that gray area is the motor cortex. And then that area in front of it is the premotor cortex. And this is the foot. This is the lower part of the premotor cortex. In front of it here is Broca's area. So again, you need to say that it is in the left hemisphere. You need to say that it is in the inferior, posterior, frontal lobe, anterior to the foot of the premotor cortex, or the foot of the premotor area. This is, you need to identify something with words, and also to identify it on a map, so you can circle around it perfectly and say, this is the area that you are asking about. So be able to identify Broca's area, the sulci, the fissures, and so on. So there is a map, we know it as Brodmann map, that defines or divides the cortex into areas based on the architecture, on the thickness, and on the kind of neurons that live on the cortex. That is called Brodmann areas. And there are about 52 areas. That it's a classical thing that sometimes, it might be time to move away from it, but you still have these areas sometimes referred to as Brodmann area. For example, for language, 44 and 45, that is Broca's area here in the frontal lobe. So again, it is very critical to know that Broca's area is found in the frontal lobe. It is only found in the left hemisphere. And then the description that I asked you about here, so you can pinpoint it, with your words and with your pen if you have to. So Broca's area is concerned with grammatical construction. It is the area that processes sentence grammar, grammar of sentences, and it enables us to make sentences that are grammatical. So important for the expression and for the comprehension of syntax, for grammar. It also has the lexicon, or the words, the meaning of words. So you also identify these words. Are they nouns? Are they verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and so on? It is important for the programming of motor speech production. When you speak, it helps construct a map. It works with other areas, with the supplementary motor area, with the premotor area, and the prefrontal cortex, to make a script of what you are going to say, and so that before you say it. And then that finally is sent to the motor cortex, and the motor cortex directly activates your muscles. Broca's area is very important for comprehending language, and also for phonemic assembly, for putting a sound with another sound. So it works with Wernicke's area on this part. Also, it has phonological memory rehearsals. It enables you to kind of, when you hear something, to rehearse in your brain the different sounds so that they do not fade away. Okay. And then the parietal lobe, the location of it lies posterior to the central fissure, or the Rolandic fissure, posterior to it, and it lies anterior to the parieto-occipital sulcus. So that goes from here to here, and it lies superior to the temporal cortex. So here's the temporal cortex, and the parietal is superior to it. So know the boundaries again for every lobe and be able to describe them. The main landmarks of the parietal cortex, number one is the somatosensory cortex, or the sensory cortex, simply, that has a map of the entire body, and every area of it is going to bring sensation from a different part of the body. The parietal lobe is very important for written language processing and for reading as well. It has areas that integrate visual and sensory, like when you close your eyes, hold something in your hand, you're actually reading it. When you read it, the sensory information travels through your arm to the spinal cord, to the post-central gyrus, and it tells you, oh, you are holding a pen, you are holding, this and that. You are just reading it like you read anything. So it also contributes to reading. So when you are reading or writing, you are going to integrate what you see with the meaning, and with using vision, and using, for example, your hands to write, and so on. So an area in it called the angular gyrus is an area that integrates visual and tactile information. So the post-central gyrus also known as the sensory cortex or the primary somatosensory cortex. It gives you feedback sensation from all different parts of the body. And it matches, in the arrangement of it, it matches the motor homunculus. So it has a sensory homunculus that goes along with the motor homunculus. The general functions of the parietal lobe include, again, make sure, be able to understand the location of every lobe and the general functions of every lobe. List, say, a number of functions or all the functions of a particular lobe. So locating objects, like say I'm closing my eyes and touching, trying to look for things, and I look and locate something, and now I hold it, I am able to read it. So I'm able to read the information by sensory centers on each fingertip. And if you want to really demonstrate how you can do this, for example, how you do the reading, just open your hand or ask someone to open his or her hand and place something on their hand. Hold your hand open like this and place something. They will have no way of telling what is on their hand. Say, especially if it's a coin or a paper clip or something, and put it there. Immediately when you say, tell me what it is, immediately they are going to make the thing come in contact with their fingertips, because the fingertips have sensory centers that are going to enable you to read the information and the dimensions of the object and the texture, and all of this send the information through the arm to the spinal cord, to the somatosensory cortex and the parietal lobe, the other areas, and then you are able now to read and the information and see what you are holding in your hand. So manipulation of objects is like, again, when you hold something and kind of touch it with your fingertips and kind of go around and feel it. Oh, I am holding this or I'm holding that. Integration of different senses that allows for understanding of a single concept. When I hold something like this, now, I can feel the different dimensions, I can feel the texture of it, I can feel the angles, and I am going to connect that with my memory. Oh, I know that, I held it before, it's a pen. So you integrate the meaning with the concept and what you use the thing for, and so on. It also is critical for the ability to attend to more than one object at the same time. Dual task. There is a pathway between the frontal lobes of the brain and the parietal lobe, and that is critical for information processing, for intelligence. It's very, very important. The ability to name objects, the ability to locate words while you are reading and writing, for example. As you are reading around, you search for particular words. That is parietal lobe function. The ability to draw or write, of course. Spatial directions, like finding where you parked your car in that huge garage instead of going around all over the place. Calculations and awareness of certain body parts and the surrounding space, like when you want to park your car, for example, and you look at the space, your eyes make a map of the space between the two lines and the front back, and you kind of hold the dimensions in your visual cortex, and then from the parietal cortex you get the dimensions of your car and you match them. You put your car in here in your imagination, put it inside of the space, and look and say, oh, my car is going to fit perfectly, or oh no, it's never gonna be fit here. If there are spatial awareness problems or difficulty with spatial processing, the person could jam the car into a tiny space and they cause a problem, or have difficulty locating their car or finding your way somewhere as you navigate your way through a mall or a place, finding directions, or the ability to focus visual attention, and also eye-hand coordination. Like you can eat in the dark, literally holding a spoon and just eating in the dark. You don't think of it because you are able to do hand and eye coordination. But in other words, for example, when you do activities to guide your hand, you do it so much that you are able to do it even without looking, even though it is called eye-hand coordination. So frontal lobe, parietal, temporal, occipital. And now here's the cerebellum. The primary auditory cortex, the area is called, it's on the temporal lobe, in the middle temporal lobe, and the area that we call the primary auditory cortex, again, on the superior, in the superior temporal gyrus, in the center of the temporal gyrus, of the superior temporal gyrus. And the area itself is called Brodmann area number 41. Next to it is Brodmann area number 42 that also contributes to hearing. So it is the auditory cortex is the primary site for information that comes from the ears, and it processes the signals and assembles the sounds into whole words, and works with other areas to enable you to make sense of what you hear. Areas 41 and 42 make, basically, they are the top of what is known as the transverse gyri of Heschel. Let me show you. So here in this map, in this area here particularly, you have area 41, 42. Let's go here. Here's area 41 and area 42. Now if you look, imagine me as, as a gyrus. My head, let's say, is area 41. And then my neck, and then my body, and my feet. All of this is a gyrus. This is Heschel's gyrus. So the primary auditory cortex is the very, very top of Heschel's gyrus. And area 42 is the very, very top again on the surface, the very top of the other Heschel's gyrus. So these are Heschel's gyri, and we call them the transverse gyri of Heschel because, see, the temporal lobe gyri are going this way. And Heschel's gyri are coming from above and coming, from here, and going transverse, like 90 degrees perpendicular on the temporal gyrus, the superior temporal gyrus. So again, these two lines, these two gyri are Heschel's gyri. The areas, the very top of them on the surface, these make up the primary auditory cortex. This is area 41 and then area 42, and the areas around this area here, they make like a belt. They are critical for auditory processing, for assembling words with meaning, and then this information then is sent to Broca's area. So when we say it works with Broca's area, Wernicke's. Wernicke's area is in the, see, this is the superior temporal gyrus. This is the medial superior temporal gyrus. And this is the posterior segment of the superior temporal gyrus. Be sure to know these descriptions precisely, because anatomy is all about precision. So where does Wernicke's area lie? It is on the posterior superior temporal gyrus. And right next to it is the primary auditory cortex. In the middle temporal gyrus here is an area called Brodmann area 21, or the auditory association cortex. The auditory association cortex. That area works with Wernicke's and works with the primary auditory cortex to integrate auditory signals with the meaning of the words. Like you hear the word cat, it comes initially as like ka, a, t. So then you assemble it as cat, but you do not know the meaning of it. And now the auditory association cortex works with the memory center, with the hippocampus, to give you the meaning of it, bring it to Wernicke's, and now you have a complete word that has meaning, and it is ready to send to Broca's area, so you could say the word, or you could, process it silently. So the person who discovered the functions of Wernicke's area was Carl Wernicke, and that was in 1876. Amazingly, he was only 26 years old when he made that discovery. Look at us and how many 27-year-olds now are able to make discoveries like that. So, and he also figured out that the area that we know today as Wernicke's area is connected with Broca's area in the frontal lobe of the brain. And the area that makes that connection, that pathway, is called the arcuate fasciculus. Arc means arch, arcuate means arched. So the arched pathway. So, but when I ask you the question, you need to tell me the arcuate fasciculus is the pathway that connects the Wernicke's area with Broca's area. Wernicke's area, as I explained, is the area that is posterior to the primary auditory cortex. It is on the superior temporal lobe, and it is in the posterior segment of the superior temporal lobe. The arcuate fasciculus connects it first. It connects with an area here called the angular gyrus, an area of the parietal cortex, and then it goes on to connect both with Broca's area and the frontal lobe of the brain. So here's the description or a map of the arcuate fasciculus. You can see it's like an arch. This is where it would connect with the territory of Broca, Wernicke's and the temporal cortex. This is where it connects with the parietal area, the angular gyrus, and this is where it connects with Broca's. So in effect, when you say the arcuate fasciculus, it really connects the temporal lobe with the parietal lobe and with the frontal lobe. So it's a very important connection. And the information in it goes back and forth. It is a bi-directional pathway. Information goes back and forth from Wernicke's to Broca's and Broca's to Wernicke's, and also from Wernicke's to the angular gyrus and back and forth. So Wernicke's areas, the functions we know of it today are phonemic assembly, means assembling sounds together to make words, and it does so in collaboration with the primary auditory cortex and the association cortex. It integrates sounds with meaning. That also it does so with the association cortex, and it is critical for comprehension of language, and it is also critical for the expression of language, for written language as well, and for monitoring what you say. So I hear myself, I monitor my rate, I monitor my pitch, I monitor my voice, and I correct if I make a mistake, or if I feel I'm falling asleep, or I'm not using the right pitch or right loudness. Without this function, I will not be able to produce a good oral output. The occipital lobe is mostly just vision, and it is the area that receives visual input from your eyes, and it processes these visual images and sends them to the hippocampus to process. And then the occipital lobe also stores visual images as well. It is, of course, critical to reading and to, you know, all the functions of seeing, you could imagine. And then the insula, or the so now we looked at all the lobes, and now we look at the insular cortex, or the insula. The insula is buried in you know, under several covers here. So if you just take an instrument and pull down the superior temporal gyrus down, and then this part of the frontal cortex and this part of the parietal cortex, you are going to find an area that is beneath, that is buried. That is called the insula, or the insular cortex. That is by itself is a lobe on its own. Okay. So the insula is involved in motor speech production. It works with Broca's area, and it is also, if it has a connection with Broca's area, it is very, very important for motor planning and motor activation. And actually not activation, not motor planning and programming. It is also the center for intuitions. It gives you that gut feeling. It enables you to feel your emotions. Like, oh, you felt so bad that as if someone kicked you in the stomach. It makes you have a visceral reaction to feelings. It is very important for making you feel emotional experiences like anger, disgust, fear, happiness, and sadness, and also your conscious feelings. When we say emotion is something that we do not feel, we are not aware of. We feel it, but we are not aware of. But once you become aware of your emotion, we call it a feeling. So again, here's the insula. It is buried beneath, or hidden beneath, three parts. The areas that cover the insula, that, you know, part, that corner here of the frontal lobe, that is called an operculum. Operculum means lid, or a cover. So from Latin. So just like this, lid. So operculum. And there's the frontal operculum, and then there's the parietal operculum, and then there is the temporal operculum. So these opercula here, the three parts, areas that cover the insula, they have language functions. They are critical for language processing and expression and so on. So I'd like you to understand, to know that these particular parts are called the frontal operculum, that little corner, the parietal operculum, and the temporal operculum. This is where all the three lobes meet, and if you lift up these opercula, you are going to find the insula beneath them. So where is the insula? It is buried beneath the frontal, parietal, and temporal opercula. And again, the opercula are very important for language functions. The corpus callosum is considered part of the cerebral cortex. It's the largest brain commissure. Commissure means pathway. It connects the two hemispheres. It is made up of the white matter. The axons that come from the right and the left basically unite at the corpus callosum. And it is the information processing superhighway in the brain that connects the two hemispheres. So it has sensory pathways crossing left and right, and motor pathways crossing left and right. And also, so it is located to the extent that as when you separate the two hemispheres, you are going to see here the corpus callosum. Corpus means body, callosum means callus, like a tough body, because it's, the axons are very condensed in there, but that is the bridge that connects the two sides of the brain or the two hemispheres. Then the angular gyrus, the cingulate. The cingulate gyrus, and don't say just the anterior cingulate, the whole cingulate is part of the cortex. The cingulate gyrus, I'm going to show you. Here's the corpus callosum. It lies, the cingulate gyrus lies superior to the corpus callosum, and it covers it from end to end. The cingulate gyrus is called cingulate because by itself is a gyrus that's unique by itself. It lies there by itself. You do not have any piece that is continuous this way from back to front except for the cingulate gyrus. And you can see it when you open the two hemispheres. You can see it. You don't have to cut or anything. This is where, this is just exposed. And then beneath that, immediately you can see now the corpus callosum. I guess I highlighted the anterior cingulate simply because it plays a critical role in motor planning, in language processing, in language, planning, language motor activities, and so on. So, but generally, please take the word anterior out. So the cingulate gyrus extends from the posterior end of the cerebrum to the anterior end, and it lies superior to the corpus callosum. The functions include analyzing thoughts, also processing language scripts with other areas, and rehearsing language scripts with other areas for motor production before you say what you want to say, and also contributes largely to mood regulation. And if someone has there is a pathway there that if damaged, it will have OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. There are also some motor planning components in it. In the middle here, there are two areas for motor planning. So now we covered the entire system, and that was an overview, and I hope that in your neurology class that you are going to delve deeply, and I hope that you deepen your understanding in that. So thank you, and my very best.